The idea of public justification. So we've already talked about five fundamental ideas like, society as a fair system of cooperation or well-ordered society, original position, and citizens as free and equal, etc. And now we're going to relate all those ideas to the idea of public justification, which is our sixth and the last fundamental idea. And there are three other ideas that are related to it, but those are not the fundamental ideas, and they are reflective equilibrium, overlapping consensus, and free public reason. Okay, so the aim of idea of public justification is to specify the idea of justification in a way appropriate to political conception of justice for a society characterized as a democracy is by reasonable pluralism. So, what is reasonable pluralism is something that we've already discussed before, earlier in one of the previous videos. Pluralism is that allowing and accepting the so many different schools of thought that exist in a given society but a particular thing at the same moment of time, and all of those are considered to be reasonable. Of course, they may have some exceptions or some may be not very reasonable, etc., but then accepting all of them, that is what reasonable pluralism is. So, democracy is something that always promotes reasonable pluralism. Now, from the preceding discussion, the idea of public justification goes with the idea of a well ordered society. For such a society is effectively regulated by a publicly recognized conception of justice. So, for a society to be well ordered, all the citizens living in it, uh, you know, on fair terms recognize accept the conception of justice, or what are the different rules and regulations that they have taken up or made so that justice prevails. From the preceding discussion we see that to fill this role a conception of justice should have three features. So what are the three features of conception of justice? First, it is, of course, a moral conception. It is worked out for a specific subject, namely the basic structure of a democratic society. So, it does not apply directly to associations and groups within society, and only later do we try to extend it to connect it with the principles of local justice and to cover the relations between people. So, when we talk about conception of justice, it is something that primarily applies to the very basic structure of the society. And as we have discussed above, that there are so many different associations and communities that exist at the same point of time in a democracy. So the conception of justice does not apply to those groups and associations directly. So they do not apply to the local justice directly, but to the basic structure of the society. However, it does extend towards it. So, whatever conception of justice we have accepted for the whole country as a democratic nation, it also somewhere or the other shadows itself on the different associations and communities. But they are not directly made for such associations and communities. So, they do extend towards it, they do extend over it, but then they're not made for the purpose of those associations and communities. Then the second feature is accepting this conception does not presuppose accepting any particular comprehensive doctrine. A political conception presents itself as a reasonable conception for the basic structure alone, and its principles express a family of political values that characteristically apply to that structure. So it's not a very comprehensive or a detailed doctrine with lots of details and theatres and rituals to be followed. It's a very simple thing that has to be accepted as the fundamental idea into our lives, that should become the base of our life, that we don't need to put in extra efforts, a lot of efforts to achieve it. So it should become a part of our life that you know we don't need to work very hard on that aspect of our life. So it applies to the basic structure alone, and they express a family of political values that characteristically apply to that structure. Okay, so it applies to the basic structure directly, and it's not a very comprehensive doctrine with lots of these and the do's and don'ts involved in it. So it should be a very basic, a very basic and main thing in our lives. A political conception of justice is formulated so far as possible solely in terms of fundamental ideas familiar from or implicit in the public political culture of a democratic society. Okay, so it is solely in terms of is formulated as possible solely in terms of fundamental ideas that are familiar from or implicit in the political culture of democratic society. Like the idea of society is a fair system of cooperation, and the idea of citizens is free and equal. So that there are such ideas in their public culture is taken as fact about democratic societies. What we're trying to talk about here is that now what is the public political culture of that society. So the political conception of justice is somewhere derived from it. Okay, the nature of, the politics of the country, the public opinion of, that particular region of society. Okay, democratic society, like the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation, or even if we look at the idea of citizens as free and equal. So this is something that has been derived from that culture, from that thing, and that then applies to the whole democratic society, and that has been accepted as a political value. Okay, we saw that in a well ordered society, effectively regulated by a publicly recognized political conception of justice, everyone accepts the same principles of justice. So the principles of justice do not apply differently to different people. The one thing that is there of this conception of justice is that it fairly applies similarly to every individual. These principles provide then a mutually acceptable point of view from which citizens' claims on the main institutions of basic structure can be adjudicated. An essential feature of a well ordered society is that its public conception of political justice establishes a shared basis for citizens to justify to one another their political judgments. Each cooperates politically and socially with the rest on terms all can endorse as just. This is the meaning of public justification, that the same thing, the same conception of justice applies to every individual regardless, and then everybody has a shared basis in it, has a shared say in it. So it is publicly justified. The public, all the citizens combined agree to something like that, and then they follow it and they value it socially, politically, they follow it and they inculcate it into their lives. So this is what public justification is, that it has been publicly justified, it has been publicly approved by the citizens, by the people. Okay, and what they do is they accept that political conception of justice, and then they make it as their main basis of for leveling the different institutions. So if we look, even if we look at, like, say, the associations or the institutions, if we take example of a university or a college, so the rules and regulations of a university is very different, and every university has different rules and conducts. Some have uniform, some don't have uniform, etc. But then those rules and regulations, or whatever they have accepted as their mainline basis for justice, all of that is somewhere inspired and is shadowed by the main political conception of justice that prevails in a democratic society. So in India as a democratic society, so all the universities, they somewhere reflect that idea which is accepted at the main level. So understood, justification is addressed to others who disagree with us. If there is no conflict in judgment about questions of political justice, judgments about the justice of certain principles and standards, particular institutions and policies and the like, there is nothing so far to justify. To justify our political judgments to others is to convince them by public reason, that is, by ways of reasoning and inference appropriate to fundamental political questions, and by appealing to beliefs, grounds, and political values, it is reasonable for others also to knowledge. So, whatever justification we are giving for certain political values that we have accepted in our lives, the justification arises from the fact by appealing the beliefs, grounds, and political values it is reasonable for others also to acknowledge. So we try to convince them by public reasons, saying that, and it's not that we're trying to convincing them or so, but it is something that we prove the validity of that conception of justice, political conception of justice, by saying that it has been approved by the public reason. The majority of the people have agreed to it by being rational, by being reasonable, and it is not something that has been that has attachment to some superficial belief. Like, it's not something that has a natural law or god given code of conduct or anything. It has been approved by careful consideration by the public reason. Okay, and by ways of reasoning and inference appropriate to fundamental political questions. So this political conception of justice is something that is like an answer to the fundamental political question, that is an answer to the fundamental political problems existing, like the like justice, equality, freedom, liberty. So, public justification proceeds from some consensus. That's very important, that it proceeds from consensus. Everybody agreeing to it. From premises, all parties in disagreement assumed to be free and equal and fully capable of reason may reasonably be expected to share and freely endorse. So, this is a very important point, and this is somewhere the base is the whole summarization of what is public justification, that it proceeds from consensus and all the parties, all the premises, all the different areas from where it has been agreed to, those people and those citizens are free, they're assumed to be free and equal, and also to be fully capable of making that decision, fully capable of having that much reason, and this and deciding from the point of view of reason and rationality, and then agreeing upon something. So it is nowhere being influenced by god or nature, or some supernatural superficial law or something. It has been approved by the public by reason, when the citizens are assumed to be full fully free, equal and capable. Public justification is not then simply a valid argument from given premises. Valid argument is instructive in setting out the relations between statements. It joins basic ideas and general statements with one another, and with more particular judgments, it exhibits the overall structure of conception of any kind. By connecting the elements of a conception into an intelligible, perspicuous whole, it serves as a mode of exposition. But when the premises and conclusions are not acceptable on due reflection to all parties in disagreement, valid argument falls short of public justification. So when we talk about public justification, it's not just a valid argument. It's not just something that everybody has agreed upon because it is valid, it is sound, and it is true, etc. Because when we talk about valid arguments, so arguments are instructive in nature. They basically instruct on things. They are like they're based facts. Arguments are like based facts that are non-negotiable, they cannot be changed. But valid arguments fall short of public justification when the premises and the conclusion are not acceptable on due reflection to all parties in disagreement. So what happens is that it may be a valid argument, but then when the premises and conclusion, that means the way through which we reach the arguments, the different stances that we take to reach the argument, and then what comes out of it, when that is not agreed upon by the people, then the valid argument does not is not publicly justified. For justice's fairness to succeed, it must be acceptable not only to our own considered convictions, but also to those of others, and this at all levels of generality, more or less wide and reflective equilibrium. So, when we talk about public conception of justice, it has to be accepted by all people, regardless the premises, the conclusion, the argument, all of it. Premises, the way we have reached that argument, or the way we have reached let's say some decided norm, what comes out of it, the conclusion and the norm itself. So all of this has to be agreed not only by one, two or a few people, but every person, all three of them. So let's say the valid argument has been agreed upon by the people, but if the premises and the conclusion, that is the way we reach to it and what comes out of it, has not been reached and agreed upon by the people, then the argument also falls short. Now, from this, we come to reflective equilibrium. Of course, it is too much to expect complete agreement on all political questions. The practicable aim is to narrow disagreement, at least regarding the more divisive controversies, and in particular those that involve the constitution essentials, for what is of greatest urgency, consensus on those essentials. For example, so what is more important is that the urgency, the consensus, sorry, what is more urgent is the consensus that everybody agrees on those what is essential, like the fundamental principles that specify the general structure of government and the political process, the powers of the legislature, executive and the judiciary, the limits of majority rule, and The equal basic rights and liberties of citizenship and legislative majorities must respect, such as the rights to vote and to participate in politics, freedom of thought and of association, liberty of conscience, as well as the protections of the rule of law. So on essential things, like we have listed, what should be the structure of the government? Now that's a very fundamental question, that's a very fundamental principle, because it governs the whole country. It will specify the nature of the whole society, democratic society. So how should the government be formed, what its nature should be? For example, if the government is of a nature of the sharing basis, of the delimitation basis, wherein the power is divided among smaller groups to the very root level, that's a power sharing government which will have more powers, which will give more powers to larger number of people, and it will be more representative. So, what will be the structure of the government? How will the judiciary be formed? How will the executive be formed? Legislature, who will elect who, and how will the check on powers would be? Okay, so even if judiciary is supposed to, be just, then again, even judiciary needs a check on its own power, so that judiciary does not overpower the other two organs of the government, or executive and the legislature. So these are some very essential and very fundamental concepts that, of course, again needs consensus of people. This is something that everybody should agree to. Also, if we talk about the basic rights and liberties, citizenship, right to vote, participation in politics, freedom of thought, liberty of conscience, all of these things are again very fundamental and very basic, and they are simply non-negotiable, and they have to be there. Also, they have to be agreed upon. Okay, even if we talk about the basic rights and liberties, then again there can be so many different ways in which one can have liberty. So how would it be organized? This is again something that the consensus is needed upon. Okay, the aim of all of this, the public justification, is to narrow it down to such principles that are very, very essential, that will form the core of the nature of democratic society. These and the other matters are complex story. I merely hinted what is meant. The point is that if a political conception of justice covers the constitutional essentials, it is already of enormous importance, even if it has little to say about many economic and social issues that legislative bodies must consider. So, if the political conception of justice does not provide the answers to different social and economic concepts and issues, but just to a political concept, still it will play a major role in the society. So that is what public justification would do. It will narrow it down so that the people would agree, the people can have a consensus on these fundamental political principles of the country. To resolve these, it is often necessary to go outside that conception and the political values its principles express, and to invoke values and considerations it does not include. But so long as there is a firm agreement on the constitutional essentials, the hope is that political and social cooperation between free and equal citizens can be maintained. Clearly, one leading aim of public justification is to preserve the conditions of effective and democratic social cooperation on a footing of mutual respect between citizens regarded as free and equal. Such justification depends on an agreement and judgment, at least on constitutional essentials, and so what that agreement is in jeopardy. uh, One task of political philosophy is to try to work out a conception of justice that narrows disagreement on at least the most disputed question. So, one very important aim, one very important thing that is achieved by political by the aim of by the idea of public justification is the conditions effective and democratic social cooperation on a footing mutual respect between citizens regarded as free and equal. So all the citizens, now again the point that citizens are regarded as free and equal has been reiterated again and again, so that it forms a very fundamental mark in our mind, that it's a very, very important thing that just cannot be missed. Even today, if we take the example of present circumstances, we see that there are so many issues regarding equality, regarding freedom, regarding liberty. Okay, who has how much powers, or what is the level of equality. We have so many things going on in the whole country regarding this. So democratic social cooperation between those citizens, so public justification will ensure that those citizens have social cooperation among them, have mutual respect among them. Why? Because it has been agreed by the majority, and it has, and all the norms that have been installed have been by the consensus of people. So one task of political philosophy have also we have discussed before in the very start of this write-up is that it narrows the disagreement. It reduces the disagreement on at least the most disputed question. Somewhere it helps and it develops into answering the most disputed questions. Contrast two ideas of public justification on matters political. The first appeals to a political conception of justice. The second appeals to a comprehensive doctrine, religious, philosophical, or moral. There's a comprehensive moral doctrine tries to show which political judgments are true as specified, say, by rational intuitionalism or by a variant of utilitarianism. Now, as far as possible, political liberalism neither accepts nor rejects any particular comprehensive doctrine, moral or religious. So, when we contrast two ideas of public justification, one appeals to political conception of justice, the second appeals to comprehensive doctrine. So, a comprehensive doctrine tries to show which political judgments are true as specified, say by rational intuitionism or by a variant of utilitarianism. Now, so far as a possible, political liberalism neither accepts nor rejects any particular comprehensive doctrine, moral, or religious. It does allow that it belongs to these doctrines to search for religious, philosophical, and moral truths. So, when we talk about a comprehensive moral doctrine, whether be it moral, religious, philosophical, but when we talk about a comprehensive doctrine, we have to show that this doctrine is somewhere arrived from, say, rational intuitionism, that is, it's intuition, that is we are born with it, and it is also rational and reasonable, or utilitarianism. Now, as far as possible, political liberalism neither accepts nor rejects any particular comprehensive doctrine. So, it's not that when we talk about it, political liberalism is not really concerned with any such comprehensive moral or religious doctrine, because it is, because all the political conception and the conception of justice, it all derives from the rational, the reason, when everybody is agreeing upon it by a consensus. So any moral or religious or philosophical doctrine, so as to say, because moral and religious doctrines claim that the knowledge and they claim that morally and religiously, that these things either come from intuition, or that has been something stated by God, or it's a very natural law or something like that. It does allow that it belongs to these doctrines to search for religious, philosophical, and moral truths. Justice's Fairness hopes to put aside long standing religious and philosophical controversies and to avoid relying on any particular comprehensive view. It uses a different idea, that of a public justification, and seeks to moderate divisive political conflicts and to specify the conditions of fair social cooperation between citizens. So, as stated above, that moral and or religious doctrines are not really something of interest to the political conception of justice or justice's fairness, because it wants everything to be derived from consensus and from the reason. To realize this aim, we try to work up from the fundamental ideas implicit in the political culture can endorse from within their own comprehensive doctrines. If this is achieved, we have an overlapping consensus of reasonable doctrines, and with it, the political conception affirmed in reflective equilibrium. In this last condition of reason reflection, that among other things distinguishes public justification from mere agreement. So, if we were to adopt any such doctrine, say moral or religious, the problem with it will be that every society will have a different moral or religious comprehensive doctrine. Different religions will have their own doctrines, different societies or communities will have their, or different cultures will have their own moral doctrines. So there will be an overlapping consensus, because many people would agree at the same things. For example, in many of the religions, let's say, lying, okay, saying a lie, is something that is deemed as wrong. So there will be an overlapping consensus because most of the religions will support that lying is wrong and we should condemn lying. So, in such a way, if we were to adopt a moral or religious doctrine, the problem with that will be that people will not be able to, agree on one thing, because there will be some areas where there will be too much consensus, where almost most of the religions will agree, and there will be some where the religions are completely offbeat of another. The idea of reflective equilibrium. Now, you know that this reflective equilibrium is not a fundamental idea, but it's a supporting idea to the idea of public justification. So we start from the thought, including the idea of free and equal person, that citizens have a capacity for reason. So when we talk about reflective equilibrium, we start from the very assumption that the citizens have a capacity to reason as well as a sense of justice. Now, under the normal circumstances of human life, these powers gradually develop, and after the age of reason are exercised in many kinds of judgments of justice, ranging over all kinds of subjects from the basic structure of society to the particular actions and character of people in everyday life. Okay, so with age, if we look normally under normal life circumstances, when you look at it, so the idea starts with that the citizens have a capacity to reason, and that capacity to reason, that capacity for justice, both theoretical and practical, so that capacity to reason and justice, that capacity grows with age, and with age people can apply that capacity, use that capacity to apply it to different matters, different, which range all over. They can be different areas, whether be it professional life, private life. There can be so many things. It may apply to money related problems, family related problems, friends related problems, office issues, anything. So they have this capacity, and this capacity can be applied, this capacity can be used to apply to the basic structure, to all kinds of subjects, okay, and particular actions and character of people in everyday life. So even everyday life, particular actions of people. The sense of justice as a form of moral sensibility involves an intellectual power, since its exercise in making judgments calls upon the powers of reason, imagination, and judgment. So, the sense of justice, because it's a moral if we look at it from a moral sensibility, that morally it is upon us to be just and do justice to everybody else, including us ourselves too. So it involves the powers of reason, imagination, and judgment, all three. Now, we select from our judgments of political justice those we prefer to as considered judgments or considered convictions. These are judgments given under conditions in which our capacity for judgment is more likely to have been fully exercised and not affected by distorting influences. Considered judgments are those given when conditions are favorable to the exercise of our powers of reason and sense of justice, that is, under conditions where we seem to have the ability, the opportunity, and the desire to make a sound judgment, or at least we have no apparent interest in not doing so, the more familiar temptations being absent. Okay, so how do we select what, so like the judgments wherein the judgments made when we were in our full capacity, we used every bit of our capacity and ability and power, and we were also not influenced by any of such factors which should not have been involved, or whose involvement hinders the correct or appropriate judgment. So that is the judgment that we select, that we take to be correct. Okay, the conditions where we seem to have the ability, opportunity, and the desire to make a sound judgment. Both three are important, all three are important. Or some judgments we view as fixed points. Once we never expect to withdraw, as when Lincoln says, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. So there are some judgments that are fixed. Okay, we deem them to be absolutely non-negotiable, that whatever happens, this is completely wrong. Okay, here he's giving an example of slavery. According to Lincoln, slavery is absolutely wrong, and under no conditions should slavery be given a green light. The positions of judges, umpires, and referees are designed to include conditions that encourage the exercise of the judicial virtues, among them impartiality and judiciousness, so that their verdicts can be seen as approximating considered judgments so far as the case allows. So, for some judgments, now of course, when we judge, or when we make a judgment, that judgment is deemed to be something that we did from a standpoint of complete ability, complete use of our power, exercise, and capacity, completely away from any distorting influences that there can be. And then there are some judgments that have that are very important, that have a fixed viewpoint, okay, that are completely not to be regarded away. There are some judgments, for example, right to life. Okay, right to life, or the judgment that everybody has a right to live and a right to continue their life in the way they want. This is something that is very non-negotiable. So this judgment is kind of a fixed viewpoint that has to be there under any circumstances. Not only do our considered judgments often differ from those of other persons, but our own judgments are sometimes in conflict with one another. So many a times it happens when we're making a judgment, even if two, three, four people are, sitting together and making judgments, it's very possible that all three or four will have different judgments, or two will have different judgment, and the two will have completely another judgment. But our own judgment comes in conflict with our own judgment. That means not only with other persons, but our own judgment sometimes comes in conflict with, say, our conscience, or we have to give such judgments where we do not believe in it at all. So the implications of the judgments we render on one question may be inconsistent or incongruent with those we render on other questions. So it may be possible under different circumstances or under different situations we make different judgments. It many times happens, if this is a very hypothetical example, but let's say that there's your very close relative who has done something wrong and has to be punished. So your judgment will always, there will be your voice in your head that will always call for a lighter sense of punishment. Or you may feel that, okay, or even if that's not the case, for close relatives, sometimes people are not ready to believe that it is them who have done something wrong. So their judgment is influenced by their closeness, by their personal relations. Until proven, they keep on believing that he or she is not the real perpetrator. Okay, for other criminals, we just make a judgment, oh, she is the real criminal. That's right. Okay, so this point deserves emphasis now that he's explaining. Like, our most serious conflicts are conflicts within ourselves. Those who suppose their judgments are always consistent are unreflective or dogmatic. Not uncommonly, they are ideologues and zealots. So, those people who believe that they always give right judgments and they're always happy with their judgments do not conflict with, and they're always like what they completely believe in, that's completely and utterly false. That's not possible. The question arises, how can we make our own considered judgments of political justice more consistent both within themselves and with of others imposing on ourselves? So we approach this problem as follows. Now, how do we make our judgments consistent and compatible with not only our own judgments, which does not happen most of the times, and but with the judgments of other people too? We know that we make considered political judgments at all levels of generality, ranging from particular judgments on the particular actions of individuals to judgments about the justice and injustice of particular institutions and social policies, and ending finally at highly general convictions. Among these convictions are those about the restrictions to impose and reasons for favoring principles of justice for the basic structure, and these convictions we model by the idea of the veil of ignorance in the original position. So, one way where we can make our judgments completely fair, completely unbiased, and something that will be in least with conflict or inconsistent with our or others judgment will be when we make the judgments by thinking of ourselves in the veil of ignorance, by thinking of ourselves sitting in the original position. And this is does not go for just one single person, but everybody. If everybody thinks from that position, the judgments will be less and less inconsistent with each other, because everybody will think from one certain point of view that they're in the original position in the veil of ignorance, and that is the place where they have to make a judgment from. Justice is fairness regards all our judgments, whatever their level of generality, whether a particular judgment or a high level general conviction is capable of having for us as reasonable and rational a certain intrinsic reasonableness. Yet, since we are of divided mind and our judgments conflict with those of other people, Some of these judgments must eventually be revised, suspended, or withdrawn if the practical aim of reaching reasonable agreement on matters of political justice is to be achieved. Now, what Rawls is telling us is that sometimes, and it has to be done, that of course, first of all, our judgments range from all categories. They are from the, smallest of actions of one individual to the highest of, problems, or the most, biggest or complex of conflicts there. But then our judgments should be bendable. you know there is a need from time to time to revise our judgment, to suspend it for some time, to completely withdraw it from the society, because we are living in a practical world where we need to keep making the changes. With time, things change around us, and so our judgments do also need to change. We may need to revise it, change it to a little bit of our circumstances, suspend it, say, for a small period of time until there's some special case going on, or even completely withdraw it. Focusing now on any one person, suppose we find the conception of political justice what makes the fewest revisions in that person's initial judgments and proves to be acceptable when the conception is presented and explained. When the person in question adopts this conception and brings other judgments in line with it, we say this person is in narrow reflective equilibrium. So there are two kinds of reflective equilibrium: narrow and broad reflective equilibrium. Now, if we talk about just, let's say, one person, okay? Now, let's say that the conception of political justice makes the fewest revisions in that person's illusion judgment. That means whatever judgment the person has made, it needs very, very little revision, and it is acceptable even in, present times and even in changing circumstances. Now, when this person who has given the judgment, whose judgment doesn't need to be revised as much, adopts this conception and brings other judgments in line with it, we say this person is in narrow reflective equilibrium. So, see, we say that the person has made one judgment that needs very little changes, and then that person is making judgments according to the one judgment that he has made before. The equilibrium is narrow because while general convictions, first principles, and particular judgments are in line, we looked for the conception of justice that called for the fewest revisions to achieve consistency, and neither alternative conception of justice nor the force of the various arguments for those conceptions have been taken into account by the person in question. Now, we're calling it narrow because all the other judgments are in line with that one judgment, and we're taking that one judgment to be the center of others because that one judgment needed very little changes, very little revision. That means that one judgment was more compatible with the past and even with the present times. This suggests that we regard as wide reflective equilibrium, that reflective equilibrium reached when someone has carefully considered alternative conception of justice and the force of various arguments for them. This suggests that we regard as wide reflective equilibrium, that reflective equilibrium reached when someone has carefully considered alternative conceptions of justice and the force of various arguments for them. More exactly, this person has considered the leading conceptions of political justice found in our philosophical tradition, and has weighed the force of the different philosophical and other reasons for them. In this case, we suppose this person's general convictions, first principles, and particular judgments are in line, but now the reflective equilibrium is wide, given the wide ranging reflection and possibly many changes of view that have preceded it. Wide and not narrow is plainly the important concept. So basically, when we talk about narrow refractive equilibrium, as we've already discussed this, that it is somewhere that there's one judgment that is not revised with the changing times. And when we talk about wide reflective equilibrium, so we are talking about so many different judgments, and so wide range of concepts are covered, and it's not one single concept or one main concept that does not change easily. So both of these, wide and or broad, not exactly broad, but yes, wide reflective equilibrium and narrow reflective equilibrium, both we're talking in case of just one person, when one person makes the decision. And very simply put, wide reflective equilibrium will involve a lot of subjects, a lot of variety of talks, and a lot of variety of judgments. So Recall that a well ordered society is a society effectively regulated by a public conception of justice. So, a well ordered society will always have a good regulation, and it will always be regulated by a public conception of justice, and it is effectively regulated. uh, we mean by that think of each citizen in such a society as having achieved wide reflective equilibrium, that is talking about a whole wide range of variety of subjects. But since citizens recognize that they affirm the same public conception of political justice, reflective equilibrium is also general. The same conception is affirmed in everyday everyone's considered judgments. Thus, citizens have achieved general and wide on what we may refer as full reflective equilibrium. That is because many of the judgments that are passed by the citizens are very much same and regarding the same subject matter. In such a society, not only is there a public point of view from which all citizens can adjudicate their claims, but also this point of view is mutually recognized, is affirmed by them all in full effective equilibrium. So, from what we said above, the idea of justification paired with full reflective equilibrium is non foundationalist in this way. No specified kind of considered judgment of political justice or a particular level of generality is thought to carry the whole weight of public justification. So, when we pair the idea of public justification, that how something has been reached by, consensus by the majority of the people agreeing on it with reason, when it is paired with full reflective equilibrium, that is, the judgment passed are on the same subject and the judgment passed are almost similar to each other, it is non foundationalist because no specified kind of considered judgment is thought to carry the whole weight of public justification. So, like considered judgments of all kinds and levels may have an intrinsic reasonableness. That means why those judgments are similar to each other. Maybe there may be a reason for that. That the reason through which we are approaching those judgment is intrinsic, is already present, and people are born with it, or acceptability to reasonable persons that persist after due reflection. The most reasonable political conception for us is the one that best fits all our considered convictions on reflection and organizing them into a coherent view at any given time. We cannot do better than that. In justice's fairness, a full reflective equilibrium is characterized by its practical aim, reasoned reflection, and its non foundationalist aspect. That means it is not something that has been found on by people, that has been, heavily discussed by people, because if they are so it is non-foundationalist because it is not something that has been thoroughly discussed by the people, but is something that is intrinsic, that people have come with it, and that is why you cannot really give a foundation to the judgments that are passed by the citizens. In this way, it meets the need for a basis of public justification on questions of political justice, for coherence among considered convictions, and in wide and general reflective equilibrium is all that is required for the practical aim of reaching reasonable agreement on matters of political justice with other ideas of justification specified by certain comprehensive doctrines. Coherence of this kind presumably does not suffice, but endorsing other ideas of justification alone will not prevent such doctrines from belonging to an overlapping consensus. So only this much reflective equilibrium is not enough, so we need other kind of things. But then again, overlapping consensus is something that needs to be again taken care of. Now, what is this overlapping consensus? Let's discuss. Again, this idea of overlapping consensus is not a fundamental idea, but is a supportive idea to the idea of public justification. So there are only 6 fundamental ideas, and the 3 reflective equilibrium, overlapping consensus are just, the supporting ideas of it. Okay, so the idea of an overlapping consensus is introduced to make the idea of a well ordered society more realistic and to adjust it to the historical and social conditions of democratic societies, which include the fact of reasonable pluralism. While in a well ordered society, all citizens affirm the same political conception of justice, we do not assume they do so for all the same reasons all the way down. Citizens have conflicting religious, philosophical, and moral views, and so they affirm the political conception from within different and opposing comprehensive doctrines, and so in part at least for different reasons. but does not prevent the political conception from being a shared point of view from which they can resolve questions concerning the constitutional essentials. So when we talk about overlapping consensus, we basically now all those ideas that we have talked about till now, you must have seen that as we proceed with the idea, with the fundamental idea, we get more and more realistic. If you look at the very first fundamental idea, the idea of society as a fair term, with as a system of fair terms of cooperation, that idea seems very impractical and seems very much away from reality. But then when it is supported by the other idea, by the five fundamental ideas, when all of those five ideas come together, they become more and more realistic. So as we proceed with the fundamental ideas, we see that the things becoming more realistic. So now, as we have come down to overlapping consensus, we talk about how the democratic society has evolved and developed throughout history is social conditions. So, like in a well ordered society, all citizens affirm the same political conception of justice. We do not assume they do so for all the same reasons. So, we have seen that, for example, in democracy, in democracy, we have been given like the right to vote to everybody. All the adults above 18 have been given the right to vote. But then somewhere we see that those reasons are not same, because before 1948, somewhere, the women in India did not have right to vote. In some countries the slaves did not have right to vote. So there are different conditions, and if something has been included as a provision in our society, there are different reasons for doing so. Okay, for example, if today it's just a very hypothetical example, again it's just for you to understand the concept better. So if, say, today murder or killing of the other person is rendered illegal in a democratic society, for us the reason may be because of the religious purposes, that the majority of the people who follow the major religion followed in a country, it prohibits the killing of a person. So the lawmakers somewhere, the law has been influenced by that thing. So how, in some other country the reason may be something else. So there are different ways and there are different reasons why one provision has been included. Citizens of conflicting religious, philosophical, and moral views, so they affirm the political conception from within and different opposing comprehensive doctrine, and so in part from at least for different reasons. But this does not prevent the political conception from being a shared point of view which can resolve questions concerning the constitutional essentials. So when people agree to something, they have their own reasons, they have their own, viewpoints why they're agreeing to something, and many a times they have opposing and conflicting views, but still whatever has been accepted as the conception, political conception of justice, and publicly accepted, it has a very much shared point of view. Thus, to formulate a realistic idea of a well ordered society, given the historical conditions of the modern world, we do not say that its public political conception of justice is affirmed by citizens from within the same comprehensive doctrine. Okay, so when we talk about it, the political conception of justice, it is not the same, it is not is agreed by from the same point of view, from the same standpoint, from the same comprehensive doctrine. The fact of reasonable pluralism implies that there is no such doctrine, whether fully or partially comprehensive, in which all citizens do or can agree to settle the fundamental questions of political justice. So there is not even a partial comprehensive doctrine on which every single citizen will agree to. And this is a fact of reasonable pluralism, because we have studied that democracy promotes reasonable pluralism, and reasonable pluralism means that there are different schools of thought existing at the same point of time, and all have their reason, all are reasonable and just in their not just, but all are reasonable and rational in their own way. So, when we talk in terms of reasonable pluralism, there can never be any, even a partial doctrine that can be agreed by every person. Even if we talk about the most basic and fundamental right, like right to life, that you cannot just go on and kill anybody, everybody has a right to live their life. Even if you go and debate on that, you'll get debaters who will speak against your thing. Rather, we say that in a well ordered society, the political conception is affirmed by what we refer to as a reasonable overlapping consensus. By this, we mean that the political conception is supported by the reasonable, though opposing religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines that gain a significant body of adherents and endure over time from one generation to the next. This is, I believe, the most reasonable basis of political and social